Good morning and welcome to the 2020 Top 10 Supply Chain Risk Trends webinar. I'm Scott Luton, CEO of Supply Chain Now, and I'm really pleased to be serving as your webinar host and Q&A moderator for this session today. First of all, really appreciate our audience joining us. We're really excited to have you here for today's official big reveal of findings from the just published Resilience 360 Annual Risk Report. As a token of appreciation for taking this precious time out of your day, you can expect to receive your complimentary copy of the report via email within the next few days. Also, keep in mind that all attendees are going to be on mute so we can optimize today's audio experience. Now, with that said, we welcome your questions, so please use the GoToWebinar toolbar to submit written questions, and we'll get to as many as we have time for at the conclusion of today's session. So I'm also really pleased to welcome two members of the Resilience 360 team who are instrumental in publishing the report and are globally recognized experts in the ever-burgeoning field of supply chain risk management. So if we can move to slide 2 there. Tobias Larsson, who is the CEO and founder of Resilience 360, has been a strong advocate for holistic supply chain risk management approaches, really ever since the beginning. His passion for developing industry-leading supply chain risk management solutions and technologies, all that's made him an in-demand conference presenter and resilience consultant around the world. And if we can move straight to slide 2 there. Okay, we're going to keep driving here. So Tobias Larsson's our first presenter. We also have Shehrina Kamal, the Product Director of Risk Monitoring at Resilience 360. Shehrina leads product development and strategy, intelligence coverage, and strategic partnerships. She also manages a global team of analysts responsible for risk identification, monitoring, and alerting activities, which to a large extent informs many of the conclusions of the 2020 Annual Risk Report, including the top 10 supply chain risk trends that we're reviewing today. So really appreciate you both joining us, Tobias and Shehrina. And for those of you in the audience, posting about today's event via social media, I'd like to call your attention to the event hashtag over here in the lower right-hand corner of the presentation. You can tag your post with hashtag ARRwebinar. And as always, you can keep up with Resilience 360 by following the organization on LinkedIn and Twitter. Once again, I'm your host, Scott Luton, founder and CEO of Supply Chain Now, where we have the great fortune of spotlighting the best in all things supply chain. That's why we're happy to host members of the Resilience 360 team for, I believe, our third supply chain event today. On a quick side note, if you weren't able to join the Resilience 360 team coronavirus podcast that we produced in January, I encourage you to give it a listen. We received a ton of great feedback on it, and we're going to tell you how to access it at the end of this webinar, along with a few other important bits of information that promises to increase your supply chain IQ. Okay, so now if you aren't familiar with this organization's work, this podcast, we believe, is a great example of what they do, which on a high level is to predict, assess, and mitigate the risk of disruptions within their customer supply chains. Who here struggles with that? And when I think back to the timing of our coronavirus podcast in late January, which was, of course, really before the outbreak had even been declared a global emergency by the World Health Organization, I guess that your customers, Tobias, must have had it on their radars by maybe mid-January?
Yeah, that's right, Scott. Great to be on this webcast, first of all. So really enjoyed, and we picked it up very early. January 11 was the first death that was reported right before Asia's peak lunar New Year season, and and since then we've been keeping a very close eye on this. This is, of course, something that all of our customers are, impacted by. We've been monitoring things like quarantines, border closures, trucker shortages, canceled flights, canceled sailings, force majeure on suppliers, custom issues, and many, many more things. And I think in total, we to date have had some 1,274 updates on the issue with Corona globally. So it's really been a topic that kept us extremely busy.
Well, my hunch is you've already seen this, because in doing my homework, you don't miss much. But Fortune magazine just highlighted research estimating that 94% of global Fortune 1000 companies experienced disruptions to their supply chains due to the virus. So I wonder how many of them had a plan B ready to go, of course, when the issues inevitably began piling up. Tobias and Shehrina, there aren't very many experts that have been in this space as long as Resilience 360 this team has. So, we look forward to benefiting from your insights. I think our audience, that's been one big driving factor in the outpouring of webinar registrations that we had. So to our audience, let's take a look at our agenda today. All right, so overview of what we're going to be covering today. I want to start out with a short explanation of the annual risk report, what happened last year, our top risk trends that we predict for 2020, the journey to resiliency and why resiliency matters. And then, of course, we want to engage our audience and give you the chance to pose your questions based on how much time we have at the end of today's webinar, and then we'll offer up a few next steps there. So, Tobias, give us, if you would, a high-level idea of its general purpose and what our audience can expect to find in their copy of the report.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in a nutshell, we really want to prepare as much as possible as we can as supply chain practitioners for 2020. So as we know, I mean, the world is getting more complex and also more competitive. So so we make predictions about the risk trends for 2020. Basically, what to watch out for. So it's the second time we released this report. The first one was last year. And I'd say sort of my prediction is that understanding supply chain risk is going to be really the essential in winning the supply chain game. If you like a sports analogy, sort of the tiebreaker. And I think most companies today understand how important supply chain management is in general to be competitive on the market. And in most companies, it's become a boardroom topic. So the focus of supply chain risk is critical I mean, just to kind of make reference one of my favorite quotes by a baseball coach called Yogi Berra, sort of making predictions are very tough, especially about the future. I mean, who knows what he meant by that? But if the way one could interpret that is sort of making sense of the past and present is also not so easy. So I think with this report, at least, we also take a very close look at what happened in 2019 and whether our predictions for 2019 coming out of 2018 were accurate, and what we learned from 2019. So I think we, in this report, also make good sense of the past, and we've last year covered over 100,000 different incidents, and Shehrina will talk more about that, impacting supply chains globally, and published on our platforms. So we think it's a very, very comprehensive report, and I hope the readers will appreciate it. Scott.
Absolutely. So, and keep the sports analogies coming. The spring training, we've got lots of baseball fans, I'm sure, plugged in, even a few Cardinals fans, who knows. But serious, kidding aside, Tobias, tell us, how does your team make the assessments?
Sure. So if we take a look at this illustration, I think it could be helpful. I think you should think about it as a funnel, really, Scott. So a funnel that kind of streamlines information to what's relevant to our customers. We monitor some, let's say, 8 million different online sources, local news, weather stations, union sites, trade bodies, port authorities, and of course social media. Of course, social media can be a great outlet for things that happen very fast, and the accuracy isn't great, but as a heads up, as an early warning, social media is important. And we use crawlers to look out for anything that we think is critical to our customers, and we learned a lot over the years what our customers really need to know. Could be anything from sort of smaller things like a public holiday to the levels of rivers, and of course things like pandemics as well and the coronavirus. So we really crawl for anything that we think is important to know, and that's interesting. And but we also have the great benefit. We were incubated by Deutsche Post DHL, the biggest logistics company in the world, with a network around the world of more than half a million people. And we use that network as well to kind of, if you like, another analogy, sort of boots on the ground, people that are close to ports and airports and see really what's going on, and then inform us about things that could disrupt supply chains. So that's a great asset we have as well. And as so many other companies, we use machine learning technologies as well to help with all this information coming in. You can imagine it's a whole lot, and to make sense of that, sort of machine learning can help to cluster, to avoid duplicates, name recognition, putting tags to things, which industry is impacted, which suppliers are impacted, ripple effects in the supply chain, and many things. So that helps us to kind of get sort of a more, let's say, refined information to our risk intelligence team. So we have a good team of supply chain risk experts around the globe, following the sun, covering 25 different languages. They speak 15. Some people in the team speak more than 5 languages, which always impresses me personally. And they validate everything before it's published in the platform, and it goes out to our customers. And again, here the DHL network is very helpful in this regard to kind of validate and corroborate information. So to really put some extra context to it. What are the delays occurring around ports? What can our customers expect when our things are going to ramp back up again? So that team reaches out to people, and more local places, let's say, and stations and so on around the world. And that really then gets out to our customers, and the customers also involved in feedback loops. So that kind of maybe helps to explain all the information we have, and that we also use for this annual report that's just been published.
Outstanding. So, and to our audience, we've already had a couple of questions submitted. Really appreciating that engagement and the questions. We're going to hold all questions until the end of the webinar, and then we'll answer those as many as we have time for. Okay, so Tobias, I think we're going to, you've already alluded to how y'all gather all the information, huge footprint globally, and you mentioned coronavirus. Are we looking to get a quick status update on that?
Absolutely. I think it will be awkward not to mention the coronavirus on a podcast like this. And Scott, I'll tell you, I've never seen something like this before. I've been working with this since 2011. That was the year where we had another very, very big, or the biggest supply chain disruption in history, which was the earthquake in Japan, and we had costs that year of over close to 300 billion, and not over, close to 300 billion. And I think, I mean, the situation here with the coronavirus originating in the Hubei province is going to exceed that by far. So I never seen something like this before, it's if you look at the chart here, the dependency that companies have on China is extreme. So just to take one example, the US here, 35% of intermediary products are coming from China for final products in the US. So the dependency on China is pretty substantial. And if you take a sort of a look, it's a very fluent situation. So giving updates, when you write updates, they may be sort of, almost out to date just a few hours later. But to give, the listeners a little bit of a feeling for what's going on at the moment, many industries impacted: electronics, retail, automotive, pharma. 90% of active ingredients has come from China. So it's a tremendous impact across industries. The Hubei province is still on a lockdown, and not to forget that. And only the latest sort of indication is that will open up again March 10, but it can of course take longer. And any companies with an exposure to that region still has tremendous impact, So in terms of suppliers not being back up and getting things out of that province in China. in general, sort of labor shortages likely to continue, of course, till the end of March. I mean, our estimates is that if you look at the capacity in the country, I mean, 50 to 80% maybe, to just give some kind of indications. Foxconn think that they will be up by March. I mean, mentioning Foxconn because they have many production sites all across China, so they could be a good indicator. They think they could be up to normal by March. Toyota is up at about 50% capacity at the moment, and some may do a little bit better. Some may be up at 80%. But then you have the logistic challenge, of course, with the schedules, and of course the challenges with rates, and that we think can only normalize by May. And we've seen over 100 blank sailings, ocean freight capacity on the Trans-Pacific route reduced by 40 to almost 50%. Many cancel. I mean, there's almost no commercial airline with passenger flights that hasn't canceled flights to China, and that is important because 40% of the capacity on air freight is in belly, and 45% of the total capacity, air freight capacity, is in belly. So that's challenging. So even when sort of things start to normalize, there's still a backlog that has to be served, and rotations 6 weeks between Europe and China will have to kind of pan out until things really are fully back to normal. So, and interesting also, I mean, how intertwined supply chains are today, and the cross dependencies. So we see now is other clusters of impact outside of China, like South Korea, and the shutdowns of Samsung's production, for example, in South Korea, is impacting Chinese companies in the mobile phone business because they can't get parts. So now, ironically, so China's production is also impacted by other clusters outside. And just the very latest news that came in that I received today was a third city in South Korea that's in shutdown. So it's an evolving situation outside of China. We see quarantines happening in Italy, as I guess most of the listeners know, and north of Italy, some 11 different cities, villages, cities under lockdown. And just to give a little bit of an example how impactful that could be, I mean, there are a company like MTA, for example. Many may not know it, but they do fuse boxes for the automotive supply chain. Companies like JLR, FCA, Renault rely on them, and at some point they announced that they will be completely shut down because being in the quarantine area. Now they have special permissions and have some capacity back up and running again. So, but that's, of course, I mean, a tremendous amount of impact. And as we know, automotive productions, I mean, they can cost up to 100 million a day if they stand still. So it is a very difficult situation. Also, suppliers in Germany shutting down. So we keep on updating, and we update our customers on a daily basis. We're daily kind of brief. Lately, we've also seen export bans, for example, on drugs. India announced, for example, that they have 26 active ingredients that are produced in India that they have put export bans on to sort of, first of all, serve the domestic market with that. So that's challenging for countries like the US, for example, depend on that. So a very fluid situation, Scott. And the last point I'm making here is sort of the peak of the inventory outages is yet to come.
Well, we appreciate that update. That there's so much to cover. It's ever evolving. And of course, many of us and our attendees are anxious to see how the outbreak will continue to unfold. So much to take into account. Okay, so just 10 years ago, the idea of having access to information like this on such a micro level would have struck many industry practitioners as remote, if not unlikely, maybe even impossible at best. So we want to dive into the trends themselves. One of the biggest reasons we're here today. So for the benefit of anyone in our audience who's just now learning about the annual risk report, you should know that this is actually the second year that the report and the top 10 supply chain risk trends list has been published. I thought it'd be really interesting to go back and maybe take a look at the predictions from last year and see how well the Resilience 360 team was able to project the 2019 trends. So Tobias, let's see how accurate we were last year. Let's walk through the 2019 report.
Yeah, we're pretty pleased with our accuracy. We reached, as you can see on the slide here, 80%. That's an acceptable result. I think we're pleased with that. Of course, we were aiming for 100%. Two things didn't increase. Two trends that we predicted didn't sort of increase in importance last year from 2018, and that was industrial unrest and drone activities impacting aviation. But in large, I would say that we 80% is a good result. It's not easy for humans to make predictions, as we talked about already, and then even machines don't get 100% right, Scott? So I think we're pretty pleased with the results, and you could read more about them in our the report from last year.
Well, continuing our sports analogies, I think sportscasters are about 7% accurate, and weather forecasters may be just above 10. So to be 80%, you're in great company. Something that really impressed me about the report overall is just the amount of attention it received throughout all of 2019. Tobias, what do you think that says about the field of supply chain risk management today?
Well, I think it's just people are craving for more information, deep information about supply chains. So it's something that's hasn't been well understood. The complexities, how everything, if you like, is entangled in the supply chain, how everything is connected, what news are important. I mean, it may sound very small. I talked about a specific supplier in Italy, and that doesn't make top news, right? But it's important from a supply. It can be very important from a supply chain perspective. If that's your only supplier, if that's your critical sole source supplier. I mean, and these things haven't been so well understood, and the ripple effects and the shortages that can happen, whether it's memory capacity or something else. So there's a lot of interest to kind of understand, because it kind of reflects how global the world has become and how everything is connected. And when things like trade disputes surface, you realize that how dependent you are, not just what happens around the corner, the suppliers you have close to your production, but how everything can impact you and how you need to stay on top of that. And traditional news just doesn't help you. Like they cover the latest thing that will give them the most attention, but there's more and more people take interest in supply chains, and that's of course something that we like and like to sort of support going forward.
Okay, so now we are going to shift gears and get to this year's top 10 supply chain risk trends. All right, so we're going to go through each of these in detail. But I got to tell you, my first impression is, cybersecurity is number one, and really, as much as we hear about that, there's probably still plenty more that we don't hear about it. So, looking forward to diving into that one. But let's pause for a second and let's give our audience just a chance to kind of skim through these really quickly. And again, to our audience, the questions keep coming in. We promise to get to as many as we can at the end of today's session, but really appreciate your engagement. Okay, so now that everyone's kind of had a quick skim of the top 10, and with the global economy relying on the smooth operation, right, of our complex and sophisticated supply chains that Tobias referenced earlier, obviously we can all benefit from greater insight into these current and potential disruptions. So, Shehrina, I want to bring you in at this point of the discussion here. What can you tell us about that first trend, especially related to manufacturing sites on the cybersecurity front line?
So, Scott, as supply chains have become more digitized, companies have occasionally fallen short of ensuring that they have necessary measures in place to deal with attacks by bad faith actors. We've actually seen manufacturers fall victim to ransomware attacks multiple times last year, meaning that their networks were infiltrated by hackers who blocked system access and encrypted data until a ransom was paid to end the disruption. So cybersecurity incidents have actually continued to pose a serious threat to supply chain operations. We've recorded a total of 290 cybersecurity incidents impacting just supply chain entities, and with September actually experiencing the highest number of monthly reported alerts in 2019. So the success of these ventures actually only encourages more infiltration attempts, which is one reason we decided to include this trend on our list. Last year, the most sophisticated attempts were actually from Advanced Persistent Threat, or APT groups. These are generally state-sponsored organizations with the skills and the resources and the patience to conduct highly sophisticated long-term incursions into corporate IT systems. We saw evidence of their involvement in attacks on multinational automakers, chemical, pharmaceutical companies, and even an airline. So heading further into 2020, the growth of APT attacks, combined with increasing digitization of supply chains, looks increasingly likely to impact industries and their supply chains.
All right, so of course the implications of ransomware attacks are often farther reaching than most people even realize. So when you think about things like expired inventory, reputational losses, right, brand losses, falling stock prices, and countless other considerations, the total cost of a ransomware attack is actually much higher than the actual ransom itself. So let's move on to the next trend, which has to do more with trade policy shifts that are reshaping global cargo flows. So I know in the U.S. there's been a lot of talk around tariffs on Chinese goods and the overall trade war for months, and it doesn't look like you expect the situation to settle down a lot more this year. So what do you think is going to happen there, Shehrina?
Yeah, if you thought 2019 was a challenging year due to the trade war, we recommend keeping an close eye on a number of trade deals happening this year. So trade and investment decision makings are being delayed by uncertainty around the scope and timing of several major deals. A number of agreements are being renegotiated as a result of the shifting political winds in the US and the UK. So with Brexit in particular causing a lot of anxiety due to a very aggressive year-end deadline to define new trade policies with the EU. So as you mentioned, trade tensions between the US and China have escalated over the last year. And while the first part of a trade agreement between the two countries were ratified in January this year, the more important second part is still up in the air until at least the US election in November. On top of that, you've got the USMCA agreement, essentially the NAFTA replacement, being worked out this year. The EU automotive companies are also skittish about trading with the US, given the imposition and subsequent expiration of auto tariffs last year. The treaty between the EU and the South American trade bloc has hit some snags and may not be ratified for years. And after over 6 years of negotiations, 15 Asia-Pacific countries are hoping to finally sign an agreement this year. So there's so much going on, and each of these agreements will have both foreseen and unforeseen effects on the flow of cargo. So this is certainly something that supply chain professionals need to stay on top of throughout the year and wherever possible adapt cargo flows.
Absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see how everything comes together in practice when or if each of these is eventually ratified. You've got the ratification and then you got to figure out what to do then, right? Especially in a practical supply chain management manner. So you mentioned the effect that politics has had on trade agreements, and going by the next trend on the list, political matters will be exerting a greater influence on supply chains in a second major way in 2020. Shehrina, why did your team decide to include economic sanctions among the top trends?
So Scott, I'll give you a couple of reasons for that. The US has really escalated their use of sanctions over the last year. But despite the increased pressure in various industries, economies, and supply chains, there's actually no indication that they'll be removed in the foreseeable future. In fact, China is considering retaliatory measures toward foreign companies, and in turn, we're seeing Chinese companies attempt to circumvent restrictions and tariffs by relabeling the country of origin on their goods and illegally transshipping cargo through third countries. Additionally, the US has also imposed sanctions on Iran and Venezuela, which has already had a major impact on energy and chemical industry supply chains. Even more notably, global tech supply chains hit a hard sanctions in the last year due to Japanese export controls on 3 key high-tech materials used for semicon and smartphone production in South Korea, all because of a diplomatic dispute. So sanctions actually appear to be an increasingly popular tool used by governments, and I think we'll see a lot more of it going into 2020.
Well, frankly, I hate to hear that. We're all looking for more good news, and it sounds like the odds of these tensions being resolved anytime soon is not really promising there. So So let's shift gears for this next trend, which has to do with social equality protesters that are targeting critical transport infrastructure. So where are we seeing this trend impacting supply chains, number one, and why will these protests continue posing a risk to supply chains this year, Shehrina?
So we've observed simmering socioeconomic discontent across multiple regions, whether it be Hong Kong, Chile, Lebanon, or Bolivia. And increasingly, protesters are calling attention to their causes by blocking highways and access to critical transport infrastructure. Things like regional airports, seaports, oil fields, borders, etc. So some of these protests went on for even a month or longer in 2019. And what's multiplying the risk is that activism in one region can also inspire activity in neighboring countries. So for example, protesters took to the streets in Colombia, for example, following extensive action in Chile and Bolivia. Unfortunately, the underlying issues of these protests, things like slowing global economy and economic discontent, are really long-running and difficult to address. Many of the issues from the last year haven't really fully been resolved, meaning that there's significant risk for recurrence.
All right, so there's a call-out box on this slide, and I can see that the potential economic losses associated with these protests can be absolutely staggering. Some of the trends on the list won't come as a shock to many, especially those that successfully keep up with the news as next to impossible as that is these days. The expense of this particular one does kind of surprise me a bit. The protesters in Hong Kong, while were carried out for different reasons, seem to take a page from this playbook as well by blocking access to strategic infrastructure. Very interesting. Okay, so we're hitting the halfway mark on the list. We've reached a trend that probably isn't very surprising, and looks like we're just about on time too, particularly since on the surface, it appears to be a continuing trend from last year, as a couple of these look like maybe. Would you say, Shehrina, that the supply chain risk you associated with national border problems in 2019 have remained largely unchanged, or have they evolved into something completely different?
So Scott, as you can imagine, risks don't always change. From year to year, there is this continuation of issues we've seen in the past year. And of course, that doesn't make the concern any less important. Many of the issues are still related to migration issues at the US-Mexican border. Also, just this past week, a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Idlib in Syria had Turkey opening its European borders and enabling the flow of migrants. How this will impact borders and supply chains in continental Europe remains to be seen. But beyond geopolitics, we've also seen problems in places where border officials face security threats or widespread smuggling problems, like Nigeria. And that's not to even talk about all the uncertainty about the effect of Brexit on UK and EU border policies, as well as a US presidential election, which may result in some extra pressure as well. So since political situations around the world remain volatile and tensions continue to simmer, we're predicting that border crossings will still present considerable risks to supply chains in 2020.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense to me, and of course, I think many can imagine that borders will continue to be an issue in 2021, particularly until Brexit, of course, is figured out, and the U.S. is going to have to get back to normal, whatever normal is these days, after the upcoming presidential election. So as sad as it makes me feel, we're going to move from politics, and we're going to talk more about climate activism, which is a really interesting topic. It seems to have increased in this last year. So how do you see climate activism heating up? Shehrina, no pun intended.
So this is actually a very interesting trend that we're predicting, and one that, surprised us as well. Over the last year, typically young protesters have staged a number of international climate strikes and protests across the world to demand stronger action on climate change, activities that we anticipate increasing in the coming year. One of the ploys that environmentalist groups find particularly effective is targeting locations with strategic relevance to industries known for high carbon emissions, such as the Heathrow Airport in London and the Houston Ship Channel in the US. And the media attention that these efforts receive is also an indication that we'll see similar activities throughout 2020. Potential targets could include petrochemical, automobile, and heavy industry manufacturing sites, along with transportation hubs and crude oil shipping routes. And protests will likely intensify during major international summits this year, such as the UN Climate Summit taking place in Glasgow in November.
Okay, so the youth of these protesters, really fascinating observation and call out there, because it can add a lot of credence to the idea that these protests aren't likely to end anytime soon. So, governments seem to also be ramping up efforts to protect the environment. What are the regulatory risks to supply chains in 2020, Shehrina?
Yeah, so we've seen a number of government initiatives to reduce air pollution in the last year, particularly in the manufacturing and transportation sectors, and regulatory bodies have pledged to do more in 2020. For instance, beginning this year, the International Maritime Organization requires vessels to use low sulfur fuels, and major shipping lines like Maersk or Hapag-Lloyd have already increased surcharges to cover the additional expenses. We'll see the impact of the new IMO requirements spread even further in the coming months as countries begin enforcing compliance among smaller shipping companies as well. Aside from that, China and India have also taken major steps to curb pollution, particularly in areas most affected by smog. Initiatives to reduce traffic have impacted the transport industry in both countries, while Chinese regulations also take aim at emissions generated by the nation's steel, chemical, and coal industries. A number of high-profile industrial explosions last year means that there's also intense focus on implementing environmental regulations to protect communities where some of these industrial activities take place. So with the effects of climate change acting as a catalyst, these types of regulations are likely to see an increase in the coming year.
Okay, so kind of from where I sit, having been in supply chain for quite some time, I love to see more and more organizations, taking emissions reduction more seriously. But as we all know, that comes with regulatory complexities and in some cases headaches that are going to make supply chain management a bit more challenging in the months and years ahead. So we'll see how that plays out. All right, so the next trend on the list was a bit confusing to me initially, but I think I understand, I believe, how it presents certain risks now, Shehrina, and I can't wait to get you to weigh in on it here. Could you please explain this item here and how that's related to new trade routes?
Yeah, so we've thrown everyone a curveball here. So actually in 2019, countries made sizable investments in efforts to carve out new trade routes, particularly via sea and rail. For example, melting icebergs have opened up new transport possibilities in the Arctic. And to that end, Russia's Atomic Energy Agency has announced plans to expand its existing nuclear icebreaker fleet, develop a new container fleet, revitalize port infrastructure along the northern Arctic route, all of these good stuff. However, the development of alternative trade routes like these are generally positive for supply chains, but there's also some inherent risks in these new routes. So for example, there could be territorial disputes around the access through the Arctic. And additionally, a huge traffic increase can further hasten environmental deterioration in the region and elsewhere. Also, China's investment in new rail-based trade routes has opened up possibilities for cargo being shipped from Asia to Europe. At the same time, we've seen logistics bottlenecks arising elsewhere, like in Kenya, where a complex infrastructure development deal that is part of China's One Belt, One Road initiative that has mandated how cargo is transported onwards from Port of Mombasa, thereby creating congestions and delays. So while many of these developments are positive, we encourage organizations to be clear-eyed about the latent risks that can also materialize.
Love that. So I can see clearly now, and I always appreciate, Shehrina, how you bring clarity to the equation, and it can help us, even us most thick-headed people like myself. All right, so let's talk about the next supply chain risk trend that definitely can't be construed as a positive development for the industry. So how do drug cartels present a risk to container shipping lines, Shehrina?
Wow, where do I begin? Seizures of cocaine found on commercial and private vessels have more than tripled over the last 3 years, and container ship smuggling in particular has taken off. And this is in part due to drug cartels exploring new markets like those in Europe, and leveraging corrupt crew on board to stash illicit drugs in shipping containers. In fact, last June, the seizure of 20 tons of cocaine by the United States Customs and Border Protection Agency from the container ship MSC Guyana was the largest ever by the US. So on one hand, you have the threat of vessel forfeiture, which is understandably a huge concern to operators, and then the cartel's efforts to traffic via shipping containers all seem to be intensifying. So we definitely expect some shipping delays in 2020 as a result of increasingly diligent security checks on container ships.
So as the audience can see, you've got a note on this slide that narcotics trafficking is currently perceived more as a supply chain complication than a disruption. So I wonder if that's still going to be the case at the end of 2020. All right, so we've reached the last trend on the list now, which relates to black swan events. So I'm really curious to see what you mean by black swan event, Shehrina.
So I know it sounds cheeky to warn everyone about black swan events, essentially events that are elusive to predict by nature. However, if we've learned anything from the recent novel coronavirus outbreak, it is that extreme impact and very low probability catastrophic scenarios can not only create devastating crisis, but also pose serious disruptions to supply chain operations, from which it can take months to recover. So while the COVID-19 outbreak may have been impossible to predict, its unprecedented spread and the extensive measures required to contain it demonstrates that once-in-a-decade disruptions are actually worth preparing for. Of course, no supply chain is completely immune from the impact of such crisis. Nevertheless, in a highly connected world with increasingly interdependent supply chains, businesses really need to be proactive in managing the improbable.
Really appreciate your time and the informative overview you've kind of walked us through there. Now that we're at the end of the list, I'm curious to see, y'all set a high bar last year, 80%. So looking forward to seeing just how accurate this will be here at the end of 2020. Regardless, it looks like this year is going to be shaping up to be a very challenging year for supply chains, especially global supply chains, which is a 99% of these days, it seems. Okay, so Tobias, I want to bring you back in. Would love to get you to weigh in on the recommendations that you would have for helping businesses successfully navigate through all of these trends that we've walked through today, so that we can't just survive in 2020, but we want to thrive.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the most challenging years to thrive in. But thinking about risk mitigations, Scott, I felt like I needed to put this in the perspective of the coronavirus situation at the moment. So, what governments around the world are trying to achieve now is by social distancing measures, if you like, is to delay the epidemic or the pandemic as much as possible, to reduce the height of the peak, but also to delay it by these measures. And so if you think about the reproductive rate of the virus, so if you can delay that, that has a lot of benefits in terms of the healthcare systems around the world being able to better cope with new cases and do as much as possible to reduce casualties. So, and really, the healthcare workers around the world are doing a heroic, effort to curb the virus as much as possible. So you have to think about coronavirus really as first and foremost as a humanitarian challenge, but nevertheless, we have to look at it from a supply chain perspective as well. And when I looked at this, I read this actually, I saw this in The Economist, this graph, and it struck me that if from a supply chain perspective, you have a similar phenomena to deal with. So there will be some kind of peak where many companies, not all, some will be able to totally go through this without any type of disruption, but many companies will have some peak in terms of outages, and that's when they don't have enough inventory at hand to fulfill the demand. So of course, as the work of supply chain professionals is to kind of really press down this curve as well. If you think about these curves in terms of economic impact, to press them down and to reduce the inventory outages that you may have when you cannot fulfill demand and when you cannot keep your productions running. And And you know, there may be some companies that can do nothing about it, but there are certainly risk mitigation efforts that can help you with this effort to kind of press down the curve. You know, we listed some of them here. They're you know, albeit very generic. You know, so supply chains are very individual and they vary between industries. You know, electronics industries may keep, tech industries may keep 30 days of stock, and some may keep 45, 60 days, more days of stock at hand, and be able to cope with the situation in very different ways. But some generic things we like to mention here at the end of the webinar anyways. You know, first and foremost, I mean, keep employees safe. Very different than the earthquake in Japan situation when we started with Registrants 360 in 2011. This is a general preparedness kind of situation. You know, there are other, as we talked about, there's other clusters in the world that are popping up, that are quarantined, and other industrial clusters, I should say. And you need to determine your truly critical components and understand where those supplies come from, ideally in multiple tiers. You know, so it's not just a maybe tier 1 situation, but also something you could impact your tier 2 or tier 3. So understand the really critical components and the inventory you have at hand for those. So how long you can basically last, and map origin of those suppliers, as I said, and then what's unique here is also demand fluctuations based on the situation. So demand is also shrinking as we have seen, particularly in China, but that also could shift to other countries. So your demand your demand situation may change, and you may need to adjust to that. So that's also very different than other disruptions we've seen in the past. Of course, working with scenario planning always helps in terms of, you know, how long can I last? You know, where are my exposures? Where are my alternatives? And play with that and the total cost analysis. But then, I mean, what is most companies would have sort of understood their exposure to the Hubei province, for example, and other areas in China, but staying on top of the news now and what new impacted clusters are popping up is going to be critical. You know, really to understand those interdependencies for your supply chains. And then the active things to do, I mean, secure inventories where you can, increase capacity from other suppliers where possible. You know, reactive to what happened to China, but even proactive to new vulnerabilities that you see, new sort of single source situations. Collaborate with suppliers and with forwarders on transportation. You know, pre-book, not an easy thing to do, but consider to pre-book transportation capacities. Alternate sources where possible. Maybe even consider shortening qualification processes in alignment with the regulations. Consider that already, and then of course global companies with global manufacturing networks can consider to, you know, shift production if possible to other locations that are not as susceptible to local sourcing issues. So yeah, those are some of the things. I mean, lead times, of course, as well, where you can extend lead times, so where you can make priorities in terms of customers and still fulfilling demand, but not disappointing customers by extending lead times. That's another thing. There are many more things, but those are some of sort of the generic things we can say. And with Registrants 360, we can help with some of these pieces. Of course, many things are also activities that the companies need to collaborate in their extended supply chains around. So I think that maybe that gives you a little bit of an idea, Scott.
Great. Really appreciate you walking through that. You know, that's information, and I think all of this is information that will benefit our audience members regardless of how they mitigate risk, and really appreciate both of you taking the time to share these deep insights over the last hour. All right, so we've covered a lot of ground, and as the metrics dictate, our audience has a ton of questions. In fact, I hate to break any hearts, we're not going to be able to get to all of your questions. I think we've got almost a dozen questions already submitted, but we're going to take the time to walk through these now. So let's start with Peter. Peter asked, and Tobias, I'm going to pose this one to you for starters. In your view, what are currently the most vulnerable products or commodities to the coronavirus caused supply chain disruption?
Well, I kind of already alluded to it, sort of active ingredients for drugs. That's something that where you have dependent. I mean, we have numbers of up to 90% dependency on China, so that's something that's extremely critical. You think about automotive productions and electronics going into automotive, that's those supply chains are also usually very lean and just in time. So I would say that those also rank very high. I also, Shehrina, if you have any ideas here, feel free to chip in. But that's sort of some of the things I can point to.
Yeah, I think what we need to also keep in mind, because of the human impact of this, we're seeing, of course, a lot of shortages in medical devices and even things like masks and gloves and things that healthcare professionals will need, and countries are starting to impose export bans so that they have enough stock in place to be able to serve their own communities. So there's many things that are impacted by the coronavirus outbreak, and eventually, as you know, in the coming weeks, there may be supply shortages also in some of these manufacturing sectors, as Tobias mentioned. So a lot of things going on here.
Peter, great question. Appreciate you participating with our webinar today. Thank you, Tobias and Shehrina, for answering. Next question comes from Andrew. Andrew asked, is there any concern about the IMO 2020 effect on ocean rates? And I think both of y'all touched on this, but can you elaborate on that concern? And let's start with Shehrina, let's start with you.
Yeah, so as I had mentioned during the presentation around the risk trend, you know, this has driven up some costs as well, and some of the bigger shipping lines have imposed already additional surcharges as a result of this. So it will impact it. To what extent and whether it continues to increase remains to be seen, but I think we've already seen the initial effects as it went into effect earlier this year.
Terrific. And Tobias, anything to add there?
No, I think Shehrina covered it well.
All right. Next question, and thanks for that question, Andrew. Next question comes from Christian. Christian asks, and Shehrina, we're going to start with you again. Interesting discussion. Many thanks. Question for you. Do you see the coronavirus accelerating the supply chain transition from China to the next best thing? And what are your thoughts on that next best thing for CPG companies? Thank you.
So that's a great question, and we've actually gathered some experience around maybe not the exact same disruption, but a similar disruption last year. So we did a survey to understand how companies were reacting to the trade war issue and their high exposure to China, and if they were considering moving away from China, basically, and relocating manufacturing operations elsewhere. While relocating manufacturing operations or restructuring manufacturing operations can be a very lengthy process, we did realize that a lot of companies were considering alternative locations like Vietnam and India, and those were the two locations that came up very highly in our survey. So I think as we live out the experiences from the COVID-19 outbreak, many companies will revisit those ideas and start contemplating whether to reduce perhaps the exposure to, or putting everything in the same basket in China. Having said that, I do want to add the disclaimer that moving away from China is not any easy task. So I think definitely companies will start considering these as contingency measures and how their manufacturing network should look like in the long run. But those are thoughts and discussions that definitely need to be had within the organizations.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Christian, great question. Final question, and I always love Q&A, but we just aren't going to get to everybody here today. Final question for Tobias, and Tobias, this comes from Malcolm. Has supply chain risk management gotten increased attention the last 10 years?
I would say so. I think there's always sort of, when something big occurs, there's always an increase in attention. But I've been working with this and Shehrina as well for 8 years or more, and there has been increased attention. And I would say that there's still many companies that haven't put proper supply chain risk management practices in place with within their companies. So if a rough estimate, I could give you maybe 20-30% or something like that. So there's still much more work to do, and there are challenges to overcome in terms of getting your data in shape and mapping your supply chain, understanding what's not your only tier 1, but also your tier 2, and so on. So there I mean, a lot of work has been done, but you know, I think the bulk of the work is still left to do as an industry as such, Scott.
All right, really appreciate that. To Cynthia and Marcos and all the others we couldn't get to your questions, thanks so much for your time. Maybe we can engage each of you after the session. And you know, we've reached that point where we've got to wrap up today's webinar. So on behalf of Supply Chain Now, I want to really thank Tobias and Shehrina for walking us through really what's a hot off the press top 10 list and sharing their valuable supply chain resilience insights and perspective today. So you certainly have given us all a lot to think about, but really appreciate the wealth of information. Okay, so let's shift gears over to a few suggested next steps. So over the next couple of days, everyone in our audience is going to receive an email containing a link to the 2020 annual risk report. In the meantime, if you'd like to subscribe to the special report emails or access the coronavirus podcast, you can go to the resources area of the Resilience 360 website. Ton of great content on that site in general. A lot of it, if you liked what you heard over the last hour and you felt that you're a much more informed supply chain practitioner and leader, you're going to love what they have there. So I encourage you to all go online and check that out. If you've got questions for a resilience expert or would like to schedule a demo of the Resilience 360 tool, send an email to the address listed on the screen there, and someone will reach out to make sure you can make the arrangements, and you know they're going to make it easy for you. Okay, last slide. If we could shift over to Supply Chain Now, really appreciate to our audience. Thank you for joining us. Be sure from a Supply Chain Now standpoint, check out our events and webinar tabs at supplychainnowradio.com. We've got a variety of in-person and more virtual events coming up with partners around the world, from EFT Reuters events to the Automotive Industry Action Group, the Georgia Logistics Summit, Modex, of course, coming up next week, much more. If you can't find something on our website, you can send a note over to our CMO, Amanda at supplychainnowradio.com. Lastly, big thanks to our guests here today on Supply Chain Now, Tobias Larsson, CEO and founder of Resilience 360, and Shehrina Kamal, product director of risk monitoring at Resilience 360. I hope you enjoyed their insights as much as I have. As I mentioned, check out other upcoming events, replays of our interviews, other resources at supplychainnowradio.com. Find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from. On behalf of our entire team here, Scott Luton wishing you a wonderful week ahead, and we'll see you next time on Supply Chain Now. Thanks, everybody.